Hey everybody, welcome back to Readers the War Game. Today we're going to be talking about something that I've been pondering about for quite a while. As both a professional author, a big reader, and a wargamer, I've always wanted to be able to represent a lot of my favorite stories in the war game. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of the Black Library, and playing those types of narrative campaigns with Warhammer 40k is huge. But sometimes I don't want to play those guys. Perhaps I'm deep diving a Brandon Sanderson novel and I want to pull that out. Or currently, I'm just about done with Task Force Hammer, which is book 17 in the Expeditionary Force by Craig Allenson. And I want to deep dive that. I want to play that and represent it. And this is something that a lot of readers have actually talked about in the past, is they want to represent what they're reading in their gameplay. Now, some things like, for example, Stormlight Archives has a new TTRPG that's on its way, which is awesome. And it's been a lot of fun to paint and prep to actually try that game out. But a TTRPG isn't exactly what I want to do. I want to be able to read the big sweeping battle scenes in any of the Stormlight Archives books and then turn around and play them. And with a TTRPG, at least from what I've seen, you're not really going to be able to do that because you're in maybe a little squad with an individual character with you and your friends. You're not going to be playing large army level fighting. So how do we go about representing that and combining it with our passion of wargaming? Because if you're here, you're probably at least passionate about one of the two. And if you are, that's great. I want to bridge the gap. I want to be able to bring my reading and my tabletop wargaming into one full suite of enjoyment. Now, I've talked a lot about this in the past. I am a very big narrative player when it comes to Warhammer 40k, which does lend itself very well to this aspect. Warhammer is both a very strict system and a very broad and open system, allowing for a lot of different things while having strict enough rules that it's a very good flowing gameplay. It can be a little clunky at times because it is so heavy, but it gives us an opportunity to really put that war game to the test. As a author, I actually enjoy doing something similar to this, where I have a basic sketch for a battle in my mind, but I need to figure out exactly what's going to happen. So then I'll use some of my Warhammer miniatures to represent different factions in that fight, and then I roll off. Whether it be kill team or boarding action or a full-scale 2,000-point game to get that big picture of the fight, when I'm writing a sci-fi story and some fantasy stories, Warhammer 40k gives me that ability to really play that out. And it gives me the ability to maybe let the dice inspire some things as well. Because a lot of times when you're playing a narrative campaign, the dice will have a mind of its own, and it will do things that are way cooler than you could do on your own. So we can take this to another level as well. So let's dive into it and talk about how we go about creating a 40k game based on some of your favorite novels. So now that we've talked a little bit about why we use Warhammer 40k for our baseline to build the narrative and the gameplay and give us a rule set that we can play with, let's talk about how you actually transport the story that's not Warhammer 40k into the Warhammer 40k universe. The story that kind of inspired all of this is the Expeditionary Force. This is book 1, Columbus Day. If you haven't read it, let me tilt it so you can actually see the cover here. If you haven't read Columbus Day or any of the other related stories, you absolutely should. They're absolutely fantastic. And they use a very similar, almost grimdark-esque story, similar to a lot of stuff written by Dan Abnett, but Craig Allenson also has a very sarcastic humor that he throws in there that isn't common in 40k. So if you're wanting 40k, deeper 40k stories with the world-ending type stories that you'll get from Dan Abnett, with a little bit of that Mike Brooks Orcs humor mixed in a little bit more closer to modern day type story, that's what you're looking for. But if you want to transport Joe Bishop and Skippy and the Merry Band of Pirates into 40k, you're going to have to do a little bit of work. And that's not a big deal. That's okay. We have a lot of really cool things that we can do with it for sure. First thing you need to do is identify a story. So for me, I'm deep into this series, and I want to represent closer to where I'm at. So you have the humans who have gone through various different name changes, as well as a lot of different current enemies. To make it simple, if you know the stories, I went with the humans and the Max Solks. They're probably the easiest to pick up and run with. So for the humans, I apologize that these have not been painted. I have a long list of paintings still to go. I went with Agents of the Imperium. This is Eisenhorn, who unfortunately actually just recently went to Legends, but that is okay for this purpose. I'm going to be using him as Joe Bishop anyways, with just the base Inquisitor rules. Joe Bishop, the closest I could represent him is through an Inquisitor. He is very much a loose cannon, does what he wants to do, and pulls on a lot of different unique skill sets that aren't common in his universe. And honestly, Eisenhorn is probably the closest you can get to a Joe Bishop-esque character, but Eisenhorn has a lot more arrogance than Joe Bishop does. So while as a practical character they're similar, as in a personality they're very different. But using Eisenhorn or just a basic Inquisitor to represent Joe Bishop would be a lot of fun. The next, you need to pick your opponent. And for me, I wanted to create the Max Solks. Obviously, in Expeditionary Force, you don't have a lot of large fights. If you do, it's typically the humans of the Ruhar versus the Kristang, sometimes the Thrannen. But for me, I wanted to give it a pure adversary so that the humans weren't too overpowered. If I were to bring Joe Bishop and the Merry Band of Pirates against the Kristang instead of the Mavericks and just basic UNIF, it wouldn't play as well as I'd like. So in order to represent the Max Solks, I had to go with one of the cruelest and most sinister factions, the Drukhari. They actually play a lot like I would expect the Max Solks to be in some form of tabletop. They have a lot of the same traits and qualities and personality that the Max Solks have as well, which gives a pretty easy one-to-one adjustment. Literally the only difference, in my opinion, is that Drukhari have elf heads instead of cat heads. Other than that, they also run a little bit smaller than I'd expect the Max Solks to run, but playstyle and a lot of qualities I think are pretty similar. So I think they'd represent pretty well. And that's kind of what you're looking for when it comes to playstyles. You can do a lot with it to get as close to representing what you're looking to do. You don't have to get a one-to-one look as much as getting a one-to-one personality and playstyle. Your imagination is going to have to run a little bit wild with it. But next, we're going to talk about selecting models to represent your guys and deciding whether you're going to stick with the actual 40k models or something else. Okay, so for this next part, let's talk a little bit about customizing the armies, making them look a little bit more lore accurate. And then after that, we'll dive into the narrative and how to build that out. And then we'll wrap it up from there. Also, over the next several weeks, we're going to be talking more about the books that I'm referencing in this video, as well as the actual game builds. I'll be doing an entire video on the Expeditionary Force, as well as this series, the Stormlight Archives. These books are massive and filled with some of the best stories I have pretty much ever read. They're absolutely fantastic. But they are pretty hard to represent because you have a really weird mix of sci-fi and fantasy. And that's something I actually really enjoy. So I want to That brings up the question of how do you represent them in 40k? There's two different routes you can go, with the first being a straight 40k army build, just based loosely on the characters. So in Warhammer 40k, you have one of the main characters. His name is Dalinar, and though those 40k fans who know this is the line, yes, he is unpainted still. Like I said, I have a very long list of things I still need to paint. But in the Stormlight Archives, the closest analog to Dalinar is the Lion. They have very similar personalities. They're both haunted by their past. They're both great military leaders, and they're both full of secrets, as well as being excellent fighters. Dalinar's nickname is the Blackthorn. He is one of the most skilled fighters in Roshar. This is him. And because of that, putting them on the tabletop to represent each other is a pretty simple way to make it work. On top of that, he is a very, very powerful Knight Radiant called a Bondsmith. Now, I'm not going to dive into too much. That is already a little bit in the spoilers for Stormlight Archives, mostly the first book. But in 40k, that's a pretty easy one-to-one swap. Same with Kaladin, who is a Windrunner. And the way he would play on the tabletop is a pretty straight one-to-one for my Jump Captain. Now, as you can see, I'm holding up painted minis to represent both of these characters because Stormlight Archive does have a TTRPG, and those TTRPGs do have models, which means I can either play my Jump Captain or I can play Knight Radiant Kaladin. Their base sizes are slightly different, but they're close enough that for a narrative fun campaign, I can make it work. Worst case scenario, if I have somebody in my group that isn't a big fan of that, it's always a good idea to have spare bases. And you can just tack down Kaladin onto the bigger base and make him work. They're even very similar profiles, so it wouldn't be much of a stretch to make him work. The same goes for Dalinar and the Lion. This is Dalinar's actual TTRPG size versus the Lion. You're going to have a little bit more problems. But as long as everyone in the group is okay with the changes, which they should be, usually if you're playing a game like this, it's because both of you are Warhammer 40k fans and Stormlight Archive fans, it won't be hard to justify the change. And because both of you know the characters, it's a pretty easy one-to-one guess. Now, it's a little bit harder when it comes to the enemies, because the Forces of Odium do have a couple representations through here. Like her or her that are represented throughout the game that you can do one-to-one replacements with. But I think this would be the best place to get a little creative. So I don't have a Chaos Space Marines army, even though that would be my best equivalent to the Forces of Odium. But if I did have to represent them based on just the armies I have, I would definitely use my Thousand Suns. They are painted, they're ready to go. And because they use a lot more magic, they would fit in quite well. Their personalities are a little bit different, and their playstyle would be a little bit different. I think the Chaos Space Marines would better represent Odium, who is akin to Khorne. But I said, we have another video coming where I deep dive this, so stay tuned. I'm going to probably put those towards the end of this series, just so I can get it as close as possible to the release of Stormlight 5, but those will be coming as well. There's a lot of really cool builds you can do, a lot of things you can do if you're dedicated to that style, especially with Space Marines. I have a huge collection. You can kind of see it behind me. As the door's open, I have white scars, and then below it, that whole black row right there, that is unpainted Space Marines. So if I wanted to really embrace Stormlight Archives, I could actually paint those based on the Knight Radiant orders and make them look as close to Knight Radiance as I can. There's a lot of really cool things you can do that way to give them a little bit of a spin. And honestly, I'm actually debating it. The only problem with that would be I'd have to paint the lion a dark metallic gray color, which he is not. Probably just going to paint him black with black metallics to make him look more old school lion. I do love a lot of the artwork from the newer lion stuff, but I don't know. I just feel like he's going to be in that black armor, especially where, honestly, that row right there is probably going to be my Risen Dark Angels. I do have some other things to pick up, but I think I'm going to go with them having the black armor and most of them having the dark green pauldrons to represent that they are from Caliban. And that'll be a lot of fun to build. But we've already talked about those. So once you have the armies built and they're ready to go, and you found some terrain that looks kind of close, the last step you need to do is write the narrative. So let's dive into it. Let's talk some of the cool things you can do with 40k to actually accentuate the narrative story. So there's a lot of things you can do, but let's start with the big stuff. First off, get a little background. Let's talk about why we're there. So we take Expeditionary Force, for example. Why are the humans and the Max Hulks squaring off for a large fight? It's not common in the stories, but it does happen. And we need to figure out why. I'm not going to answer that question here. Stay tuned here for a couple of weeks, and you'll get that answer when we talk about the actual game, the one that I built that I want to play. Next, we want to talk about what type of missions do we have? Are we playing kind of a capture the flag game where we both have objectives? One of the things I actually love the most when it comes to the Lord of the Rings game is there's actually a couple of gameplays where one side is trying to capture the other side's hero. For Warhammer 40k, if we were playing Expeditionary Force, one of the things Max Hulks are always after is to capture Skippy, the Elder AI. And I would represent him on the tabletop, whether it be with an actual character or just one of the little guys, or even just grab one of the Terminator homing beacons and use it that way. Or if you literally just want to grab a can of soda and put it on the table, also works. But with all of those, having that why will give you a baseline to build that narrative. Once you know the why, the first thing you're going to want to figure out is the deployment. I'm pulling here from the Leviathan box, but if I were to be building a Warhammer 40k build, I would probably go search and destroy. This gives my units the ability to kind of spread out and search for each other, because in a lot of contexts, the Max Hulks will probably be blinded by Skippy, and the humans will probably be a little bit outgunned, so they're both going to be moving very cautiously to try and best represent their armies and their movements to maximize damage against the opponent. So after we have our deployment, the next thing we need to talk about is our mission rule, the thing that will shape the landscape across the board. And for me, representing Expeditionary Force, Scrambler fields are probably the best one to represent it. Skippy's going to be clouding a lot of the Max Hulks. The Max Hulks will be shrouded in trying to cloud as much of the humans as they can as well. And finally, the best way to shape the narrative is the primary mission. Now, most likely in the Expeditionary Force, both armies have their own objectives and what they're doing. But one of the most common missions is fighting over intel. It's one you see quite frequently orchestrated by the Merry Band of Pirates across the board. And for me, deploying servo skulls is the best way to represent that. Now, you can come up with your own separate rules if you like. This is just an easy way to make it work. Now, that's the basics. You can take it a lot further and give secondary objectives to both sides of the force. You can throw environmental twists in there as well. However you want to do it, you can definitely do it. You can be a lot more creative if you want, or like I just did pretty quickly, you can actually just pull straight from the Leviathan box and give some basic build to represent the story quite well and still stick within the general rules and not have to get very creative on rule details. Now, if you want to see full details on how we do that and everything we do in this mission, like I said, here in a couple weeks, you're going to get the full rundown. It won't be a full battle report because honestly, I don't have the agents of the Imperium Army to represent the humans properly. Eventually, I may be able to pull that off, but for now, I'm just going to give an army breakdown so that you can actually go and play that game if you want. I would love to see any videos or anything like that you do as well. So make sure you tag me in those. Also, if you have a book that you want me to do a breakdown on, similar to basically what I've done here with Expeditionary Force Stormlight Archives, I'll be doing in detail here in a few weeks, let me know in the comments below. I want to do more of these videos. This is a really fun thing for me to do, to build army lists based on characters and stories, as well as looking at the narrative gameplay that you can do. That also includes 40k books as well. I do enjoy doing that along with it. We've been doing a lot of narrative campaigns across the board, including one where my entire play group is fighting over a single world, and I'm currently at the helm of my 1,000 Sons to try and push them off and maintain the world for chaos. So if you want to hear that kind of stuff as well, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe so that you can make sure you're around for all of the other videos we have coming. And ring the little bell down in the corner so that you get notified when your favorite book is done as well. I'll see you guys next time.